Hi everybody, John Monroe here, introducing this week's topic for our Globalization since 1945 module. This week we're looking at mobilities and the relationship between history and mobility studies. So I'm outside again, as I often am on these digital lectures, but normally I've been sort of outside to give the backdrop as just something kind of interesting to look at as I've been, talking about the topic, racial capitalism, Cold War, now mobility. But this week, the backdrop that I have, and again, anyone from Birmingham will know where exactly I am. The backdrop here is much more important to the theme that we're looking at this week with mobility and reading Eric Avila's The Folklore of the Freeway, Race and Revolt in the Modernist City. So of course, Avila is looking at the US context of freeways, and I'll say a little bit, and resistance to them, seen and unseen. I'll say a little bit about that as I go. But what I want to do is make my way underneath to explore a little bit underneath this interchange here, the Gravelly Hill interchange, best known as the Spaghetti Junction, where the Aston Expressway meets the M6. This is one of the biggest kind of freeway junctions, probably in Britain, definitely in this area. So I'm going to, as the historian Erica Hanna in her work on cycling and infrastructure and public space in Ireland has looked at, I'm going to try seeing like a cyclist as I make my way. I'm going to go underneath. I'm going to go kind of underneath as pedestrians would go, underneath one of the kind of roundabouts over there. Then I'll go on a little bit of the road. I think I can make a kind of loop around and come back again to see from another angle, looking from below, from the canals. So I'll try. It's a kind of a figure eight I have in mind. We'll see if it works. And so while I go, I'll say a little bit about the topic, a little bit as I ought to about historiography, but in particular, the mise en scène is the message this time. It's really what we're going to look at is really germane to our topic. So got my bike. I'm going to head out here. This is the River Tame. I'm going to make my way through this park and go underneath the interchange here from a couple of different angles. So let's take a look. Bit of a contrast here, the pleasant reservoir and greenery on my right with everything that's on my left. So this is the I'm heading away from the neighborhood of Aston here and towards Erdington, and that's where this interchange forms one of those border vacuums that Jane Jacobs wrote about and that Eric Avila mentions in Folklore of the Freeway. This kind of dead zone where vehicles are passing through, but there's not much life otherwise. It's also interesting because on my left here, the Tame River is Birmingham's kind of principal river, so it's one of its sort of major elements of nature running just directly next to this other thing. Also makes for an interesting contrast. So as we're gonna see, there's a pedestrian, I think cyclists are a bit of an afterthought, which pedestrians are the most important to get through here anyways. People need to get from one part of this kind of one side of this border vacuum to another. And we'll see what that looks like. And maybe look for some glimpses of that folkloric sort of resistance that Avila writes about. I was asking one of my colleagues, Malcolm Dick, a historian who knows a lot about the West Midlands. I asked him, what was here before they put this up in the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s? A quarry, he told me immediately, which It's a nice thing working at a university. You can ask smart people questions, they know the answer. Which also explains why the immediate neighborhood on the other side of this roundabout that I'm going to go through is called Gravelly Hill. But there were also some displacement of people, some houses. Historians who know more about the local history will know more about that. Okay, so this is the pedestrian passage. I wouldn't call it friendly. We've got some graffiti. It's not too surprising. I don't know if you can hear me over the noise because this is really the centerpiece here. Let me just ride around a little bit before I leave it. Give you a bit of a sense of it. Some advertising above, some graffiti. And just the big junction. By US standards, especially Los Angeles standards, this isn't that impressive, I guess, but for around here, it's quite a bit. Oh, a little bit of, now this is one of my favorite examples of kind of folkloric repurposing. Looks like we've had some skateboarding happening down here on this curb, so that's another kind of reclamation of otherwise quite hostile space that people engage in. Okay, so I'm gonna head out to the Gravelly Road Gravelly Hill, sorry, area. I think it's up here. Oh, scratch that, I've gone the wrong way. Oh, it's easy to get confused. Oh no, wait a minute. I thought I was gonna come up on the other side. Okay, I'm on the wrong side of the road, but I'm on the road that I wanna be on, that's fine. Let me get across and go from there. So I'm gonna go through the neighborhood for a little bit in order to come back through the junction again, but from another angle, this time on the canals. Let's see if I can get across the road here. I better get off my bike. This doesn't look too easy. Okay, so in a way, this is what we might think of as kind of the spillover effects from the junction. This obviously isn't a road this a direct off-ramp, but the way in which the priority for automobility creates a sensibility throughout the city of cars first, cars only, etc. So we've got a bit of that here. But we've got a bicycle painted on the road. I never really know what that means, but I guess it's letting drivers know that it's possible that someone might come through here on a bike. But again, for pedestrians who live in this neighborhood, who want to pass through the area where I just was, or if they want to go over to the reservoir there, take a stroll, they have to negotiate a pretty harsh environment. It would be kind of hard to imagine going through there at night. It seems potentially unsafe. And this connects to another point in Avila's book, which is that whole chapter on the gendered power of freeway infrastructure and the godlike view that it represents, but also the kind of gendered consequences that it has in terms of access for people who are displaced or who live close by and need to navigate without a car. Okay, so again, just making my way through the neighborhood here to get around to the other side, and so I can get onto the canal. And that's another thing about the Spaghetti Junction, is that it's a meeting place of two major freeways, or motorways as they call them here, but it's also built on pre-existing, a really significant pre-existing canal junction. In the US example, it's a little more carte blanche, the way that freeways were just drawn through without any kind of reference point often to the history of the places before. In this case, there is a historical reference point in the canals, as we'll see. It'll probably take me about 2 or 3 minutes to get over there, so while I do that, I'll also say just a little bit more about mobility studies, our topic for this week. And what I particularly want to point out, and I'll say a little bit about some of where this comes from and some of what I regard as a few of the key works. But one thing that's interesting to note about mobility studies, in contrast, say, to the debates that I talked about in terms of racial capitalism, is that what mobility does as a lens, again, to use that term that I used in reference to the Cold War, mobility, I would say, is a kind of additive lens, in that, sorry, catching my breath as I get up this hill, in that it speaks to a complementary and additional way of theorizing a given set of relations. So rather than, as I mentioned before, a kind of race versus class debate, hi there, thank you, a kind of race versus class debate, mobility is never mobility versus race or mobility versus class, but rather, how do we understand race or class or both or gender or sexuality, etc., ability, age, differently when we think about mobility. So maybe we can think about connecting mobility studies to a topic that we've already looked at, racial capitalism, and maybe to neoliberalism as well, which I know will be coming up later in the module. So just briefly, let me say, thinking about racial capitalism and mobility, again, as I talked about with Cedric Robinson's kind of foundational work on racial capitalism and theorizing the relationship between race and class, and also historically the relationship between capitalism and slavery, a kind of additional way to see that, that's not at the expense of Robinson's insights, but I think are complementary to them, is to see that through a mobility lens. So if you think about the theft of human beings on the African continent and the kidnapping of them and taking them to the Americas as a kind of forced mobility, and my colleague Nathan Carden speaks really eloquently about this, and I've learned quite a bit from him on thinking about racial slavery and mobility together, and then thinking about enslavement in the Americas as a forced immobility, when people were not allowed to move about at liberty, and of course escaping was, to risk one's life. There's a way in which mobility doesn't displace race, class, and gender in the analysis of racial slavery, but instead just gives us a kind of additional way of thinking about it, that structures of power operate through movement, through forms of movement, and through forms of control of movement. And that's also some of what transportation infrastructure relates to as well. So the canals of old, now you see I'm on them, and the freeways of the 20th century. And as you can perhaps see in the distance, I'm heading back towards the junction again from this angle. So we can think about mobility and racial capitalism in I think productive kind of ways. With neoliberalism, it's also an interesting, and this is to really kind of center automobility here, I think there's an interesting way that we can think about, just a second, hi. There's an interesting way that we can think about neoliberalism. The periodization of neoliberalism maybe looks a little bit different with mobility at the center. So one way we might think about this is maybe to think about the infrastructural project that is the Spaghetti Junction, or the kind of, well, maybe that first. So if we think about the Spaghetti Junction as a major, you know, the days of social democracy when the state embarked on major public works kinds of projects, as opposed to today's neoliberal state where it seems the individualism has become so deeply embedded that the actors in the state are just, you know, trying to avoid taxes, pay their friends money out of public funds and enrich themselves. So maybe we can think about that kind of state formation as a neoliberal coming out of a Fordist kind of situation. But maybe if we put automobility into that story, maybe we can think of automobility as sort of neoliberalism's Trojan horse, in that automobility, through infrastructure projects like this, but also the manufacture, the classic Fordist, of course, the Ford factories, the classic Fordist kind of production setup, was to produce a product, like all products of capitalism, one to be consumed. And cars in particular lend themselves to a kind of individualist ethos. And so maybe neoliberal individualist sensibilities were already being manufactured in the Fordist plants of the mid-century, and through these kinds of large-scale state-led infrastructure projects like the Spaghetti Junction and like freeways across the United States and other countries. Okay, so this is where the canal goes underneath the Spaghetti Junction, and look at this spot of light here. Let's take a look. Real history from below here. We're going to take a look above, see if we can see a bit of it. Not much to see, but clearly not a very inviting environment down here, that's for sure. But also we do see again a bit of that folklore, a bit of that kind of cultural resistance or cultural rethinking. I was reading on, there's a nice cultural history of the Spaghetti Junction online. You can read from the I Choose Birmingham website. I'll post a link below this video. And there's something there about films and so on that were set here, but also something about the artist from the band KLF did some painting under here. I don't see any evidence of it here. Maybe it's gone now, I'm not sure where exactly it was, but fits in with kind of Avila's analysis of rethinking what this is, what this space is supposed to be, what it's for, and what it can represent. So let me just say, I'm coming up to the old canal junction here. So this is kind of the crux of it all. I've passed under the main part of the freeway junction. And now let me get up onto this bridge here and steep hill and have a look at the canal junction. Okay, so just another view. So this is where it kind of, the different historical sedimented layers come together here, with the canal junction below and the freeway junction above. Okay, really interesting. And I can't give a reading of graffiti and the kind of street art that's down here, but it would be very interesting for someone to come and do that. Maybe the folks at I Choose Birmingham, because they've already got quite a bit of knowledge about this space down here. In particular, again, it's cultural kind of resonances. Okay, it's starting to rain, so apologies, wipe the camera lens for that's probably going to obscure the lens a little bit, but that's okay. I'm almost done, actually. Not too much farther to go. But before I wrap up, let me just say a little bit about some of the key works here. So I think for mobility studies, I'd want to stress a couple of things. One is, it's a very interdisciplinary conversation. It mostly doesn't involve historians. It does to a degree. I mean, Eric Avila is clearly one, but it's been largely a kind of social science endeavor, people in sociology, and in particular geography. but it's also it's an interdisciplinary space where writers in one discipline have really influenced the thinking of others. So for mobility studies, I would say, well, one thing to check out is journals like Transfers and Mobilities. There's some kind of key journals out there you can have a look at. But in terms of works, I would say that I don't think it's quite a mobility turn, but the back to the hostile roads. But the work in mobility studies, one of its sort of origin places is the geographical focus on space. And we do have that in history, a kind of spatial turn in historical work. And Henri Lefebvre's The Production of Space from 1974, I think it is the most often cited kind of origin point for this. And as a philosopher and theorist thinking about intellectual space and kind of the physical space of the street and the neighborhood together in kind of essay form is what you get in that important work. A bit more recently, David Harvey's The Condition of Postmodernity is another good example I'd point to of a geographer thinking about space and thinking about the relationship between space, power, and particularly capitalism in the case of The Condition of Postmodernity from 1989. And that book is a theorization of kind of some of the stuff I was just talking about in terms of, sorry, I gotta be careful here. In terms of the switch, as he calls it, from Fordism to flexible accumulation. He's theorizing in the moment, in the late 80s, about neoliberalism's ascendancy coming out of and revising the Fordist model of production and of cultural production that kind of follows from that as well. A bit more recent than that, Ruth Wilson Gilmore's Golden Gulag is a work, again, it's a spatial analysis of mass incarceration in California. And it's got some connections to Avila's book in a way. It's not about mobility per se, though the opening scene in the book of women going to on the bus to visit people who are incarcerated speaks to mobility immediately, but that book also resonates with Eric Avila's in that it looks at the system of mass incarceration as a kind of form of defeat of labor movements, and particularly of the Black freedom struggle. Not that the Black freedom struggle is completely defeated, but as an important kind of move against the radical freedom movements of the 1960s. So this kind of focus on space, taking space seriously, spatiality, we might say in a bit more fancy of a term, is kind of the background. Once you're thinking about space, then it's a short step to start thinking about moving through space. And so I'll leave us by pointing to a couple of what I see as key works that kind of bring mobility, a focus on mobility, and that bring mobility studies and history together. Cyclists dismount, okay? You see these signs quite randomly in the city here. I don't really know what they mean. Dismount for how long? Actually, maybe I'll just walk the rest of the way. I'm already at my destination. So let me just say the Cotton Sailor's book, Republic of Drivers, is another key cultural history of automobility. And that book looks at, it's kind of like the 20s through to the 50s, and it looks at the ways that the driver became kind of, the identity of the driver became synonymous with the identity of the citizen. And it's important work in terms of laying the foundations for the centrality of a kind of car driving sensibility throughout the United States, and very applicable elsewhere. I also would point to Geneviève Carpio's Collisions at the Crossroads, I think that came out in 2019 or so, as a more recent example of the of mobility studies. This is looking at the kind of eastern suburbs, far suburbs, the Inland Empire, just east of Los Angeles, and looking at the ways that cycling in the late 19th and early 20th century was policed and racialized, and looking at the movement of poor whites from Arkansas and Oklahoma coming to California during the Depression, and looking at that through a kind of mobility lens and the whiteness of the impoverished people who made that trip and the ways that they were represented. So just some interesting kind of ways of looking at, again, with different layers, the ways that mobility can enhance our understanding of other topics that we may feel that we know a little bit about. Peter Norton's Fighting Traffic is another one that looks at how public space became transformed around cars, particularly in the 1920s and into the 1930s, a really kind of foundational decade for that transformation. So, okay, I think I'll leave it there. Back at the Tame River here, back at the reservoir, and I'll put some links below for some of the readings that I've mentioned, and maybe one or two others that I might have forgot. And as always, I look forward to the discussion on the discussion boards, and I'll see you on there. Bye.